Imagine strolling through a medieval garden, towering hedges forming intricate labyrinths, vibrant flowers spilling over stone pathways, the air thick with the scent of herbs and blossoms. It's easy to assume these spaces were designed purely for pleasure, a tranquil escape from the harsh realities of life in the Middle Ages. But what if I told you that some of these gardens were anything but peaceful? Beneath their beauty lurked danger, deception, and even death. Welcome to the shadowy world of the poisoned orchard, where horticulture became a tool of power, intrigue, and sometimes murder. These gardens weren't just places of leisure, they were carefully crafted traps disguised as paradise. Picture this: a nobleman's guest admiring a seemingly innocent flower, unaware that its petals contained a toxin potent enough to kill with a single touch. Or a rival lured into a secluded arbor where the very plants surrounding them could induce a slow, agonizing end. In an era where power was often seized by any means necessary, gardens became the perfect cover for sinister plots. The same hands that pruned roses might also be plotting a rival's downfall, using nature itself as a weapon. Why would something as beautiful as a garden become an instrument of harm? The answer lies in the brutal politics of the medieval world, where appearances were everything and survival often depended on secrecy. Plants with deadly properties weren't just grown, they were cultivated with purpose, their uses passed down in whispers. Some gardens were designed to impress, yes, but others, they were designed to intimidate, to test loyalty, or to eliminate threats without a trace. By the time we're done, you'll see these lush, green spaces in a whole new light, and you might never trust a bouquet quite the same way again. So let's step past the facade and uncover the dark truths hidden among the petals and leaves. The peaceful medieval garden is a myth we've inherited from fairy tales and romantic paintings, a place where knights and ladies wandered among roses, untouched by the violence of their time. But the truth is far more fascinating. These gardens were never just decorative. They were living laboratories where monks, healers, and even assassins studied the dual nature of plants. Take the humble monkshood with its striking blue flowers. To the untrained eye, it was just another bloom in a monastery's herb garden. Yet those same roots could paralyze a man in minutes if slipped into his wine. Even the most beautiful plants hid deadly secrets. Castles took this duality to another level. A noble's garden wasn't just a display of wealth, it was a calculated statement of power. Guests walking through might admire the delicate belladonna, not realizing its berries could stop a heart, or they'd be offered wine flavored with sweet-scented water hemlock, a plant so poisonous that ancient Greeks used it for executions. These weren't accidents, they were subtle tests, a way to gauge loyalty or eliminate rivals without drawing a blade. After all, what better alibi than nature itself? Monasteries played an even stranger role. Behind their walls, monks meticulously documented which plants cured fevers and which caused them. Their gardens blended piety with pragmatism, calendula for healing wounds, foxglove for heart ailments, and wolfsbane for less holy purposes. Knowledge was power, and in the wrong hands that power turned lethal. Some historians believe certain abbots kept poison gardens as a quiet insurance policy against rebellious nobles or overzealous kings. What makes these gardens so chilling is how ordinary they seemed. A trellis heavy with fragrant honeysuckle might conceal a patch of deadly nightshade. A decorative pond could be ringed with hemlock, its leaves mistaken for parsley. In a world without modern forensics, poison was the perfect crime, and the garden was its perfect accomplice. So the next time you picture a medieval garden, don't just see the beauty, see the cunning. because in an age where survival was a game of shadows, even the roses had thorns for a reason. Poisonous plants weren't just lurking in the shadows of medieval gardens, they were front and center, cultivated with precision and purpose. Take belladonna, for instance. Its glossy black berries might look tempting, but just a handful could send a person into a feverish delirium before stopping their heart. Yet this same plant was prized by physicians for dilating pupils during eye surgeries, proving that even the deadliest botanicals had their uses. The line between medicine and murder was razor thin, and those who understood plants held life and death power in their hands. Apothecaries were the gatekeepers of this dangerous knowledge. In dimly lit workshops, they ground hemlock roots into powders or steeped monkshood leaves into tinctures, all while keeping meticulous records of dosages. A pinch too much and a remedy became a weapon. It's no wonder these experts were both revered and feared. Wealthy patrons, dukes, bishops, even kings routinely employed herbalists, not just to cure ailments but to secure insurance against rivals. A well-stocked poison garden was as much a status symbol as a suit of armor or a vault of gold. The political intrigue didn't stop there. Imagine a banquet where every dish held potential peril. A nobleman might toast his guest with wine infused with harmless herbs one night, only to serve the same drink laced with water hemlock the next. Plants became instruments of psychological warfare, their presence a silent threat. Some lords even designed their gardens as traps, placing toxic species like deadly nightshade near seating areas where unsuspecting visitors might pluck a berry out of curiosity. In a world where trust was scarce, every leaf and petal could be a test of loyalty, but it wasn't all treachery. Poison gardens also served as grim classrooms. Apprentice healers learned to identify lethal plants by sight and smell, because mistaking parsley for poison hemlock could doom an entire village. Monasteries, often the era's centers of learning, grew these dangerous specimens behind locked gates, studying their effects to better combat accidental poisonings. Even the most virtuous monk knew that understanding evil was the best way to defeat it. What's most striking is how ordinary these deadly plants appeared. Hemlock blended into meadows, foxglove sprouted innocently along roadsides, and the vibrant petals of autumn crocus concealed a toxin that could shut down organs. In an age without modern science, survival depended on keen observation and sometimes suspicion. The next time you admire a medieval tapestry filled with flowers, look closer. Those carefully stitched blooms might just be hiding a darker story. Monasteries, those serene islands of prayer and contemplation, held secrets far darker than their peaceful cloisters suggested. Behind high stone walls, monks tended gardens that were equal parts sanctuary and apothecary's workshop, rows of healing herbs growing side by side with plants that could kill in minutes. These men of God weren't just scribes and scholars, they were some of the most skilled botanists of their age, mastering nature's duality with chilling precision. Take the Benedictine monks of St. Gall, whose 9th century garden plans still survive. Their meticulously drawn plots included henbane, a plant that could induce hallucinations, alongside basil and sage. Every leaf had its purpose, whether for salvation or something far more sinister. The Church's relationship with poison was complicated, to say the least. On one hand, monasteries were havens of healing, where monks brewed remedies for everything from fevers to battlefield wounds. Yet the same hands that prepared soothing balms could also distill deadly tinctures. Manuscripts like the Circa Instans, a medieval herbal guide, detailed how much wolfsbane might ease joint pain and how much would stop a man's heart. Knowledge was power, and the Church guarded it fiercely. Some abbots even kept locked gardens accessible only to senior monks, where the most dangerous plants were cultivated away from prying eyes. Was this secrecy for protection or something more nefarious? Consider the case of Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, a visionary polymath who wrote extensively on herbal medicine. Her works praised the virtues of plants like fennel and yarrow, but also described the precise symptoms of hemlock poisoning with unsettling clarity. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. During the investiture controversy, when popes and emperors clashed over power, rumors swirled of abbots providing special remedies to political allies. A well-timed illness could shift the balance of an entire war. What's most striking is how these practices were justified. Monks saw themselves as stewards of divine knowledge, and that included understanding the darker corners of creation. If God made poison ivy and deadly nightshade, then studying them was a form of devotion, a way to unravel the mysteries of a fallen world. But as any medieval ruler knew, devotion could bend under pressure. When a king demanded a monastery's loyalty, was it a sin to slip something bitter into an enemy's cup? The line between piety and pragmatism grew dangerously thin. By the late Middle Ages, some cloisters had earned quiet reputations. Travelers spoke of the Abbey of St. Arnaud, where the roses were said to wilt if touched by someone with wicked intentions. More likely, those roses were planted alongside toxic oleander, their perfume masking something far deadlier. Even the architecture played a role. Herb gardens were often placed near scriptoriums, where monks could observe visitors while pretending to transcribe scriptures. A dipping pen could hide a watching eye, just as a prayer book could conceal a vial of something untraceable. This duality lingers in the artifacts they left behind. A beautifully illuminated manuscript might feature a marginal sketch of a monk tending mandrake, its scream supposedly lethal when uprooted. Were these illustrations warnings or instructions? We'll never know for certain, but one thing is clear: in the shadow of the cross, the medieval garden grew far more than salvation. It cultivated power, and power, as any monk could tell you, has always been a bitter harvest. Castle walls and moats weren't the only defenses keeping medieval nobles safe. Their gardens were battlefields in disguise. Picture a trespasser scaling a castle's outer wall at night, only to drop into a thicket of thorny roses, their razor-sharp barbs laced with irritants that turned every scratch into a burning wound. Or imagine an invading force stumbling through what seemed like an ornamental hedge maze, only to find themselves disoriented by the scent of datura, a plant whose fumes could induce terrifying hallucinations. These weren't accidents of landscaping. They were deliberate, calculated strategies to turn nature itself into a silent sentry. The most cunning nobles took this concept even further. Some designed their gardens with pleasure paths that led unsuspecting intruders straight into danger, a tranquil pond edged with water hemlock, or a charming arbor draped in bittersweet nightshade. What looked like a noble's vanity project was often a carefully laid snare. Even the choice of plants sent a message. A lord might line his courtyard with stinging nettles, not just for their medicinal properties, but as a visceral reminder to visitors: cross me and you'll regret it. The same garden that hosted poetry readings at noon could become a lethal labyrinth by night. But these defenses weren't just about physical harm. They played psychological games too. A garden filled with belladonna and wolfsbane whispered a clear threat to rivals. I know the secrets of the earth, and I'm not afraid to use them. For nobles in unstable regions, a poison garden was like displaying a row of pikes, an unmistakable warning wrapped in beauty. Some castles even cultivated plants with sinister reputations, like mandrake, whose human-shaped roots were said to scream when harvested. Whether or not the legends were true, their presence added an aura of dread, making enemies think twice before plotting against the lord who grew them. What's fascinating is how seamlessly these defenses blended into daily life. A garden might feature yew trees, their elegant branches shading a banquet table, yet those same trees produced berries so toxic that just a few could kill a grown man. Guests would dine beneath them, oblivious to the danger unless they dared to overstep. Even the castle's herbalists walked a fine line, stocking remedies for common ailments while quietly tending plants that could cause those very symptoms. In a world where betrayal lurked behind every smile, the garden was the perfect metaphor, inviting on the surface, deadly beneath. The legacy of these defensive landscapes lingers in unexpected ways. When you visit a historic castle today and see ivy climbing its walls, remember, those vines might have been planted not for beauty, but because their dense growth made scaling the stones nearly impossible. Every element had a purpose, from the prickly gorse bushes that deterred spies to the fragrant lavender that masked the smell of more dangerous herbs. Medieval gardens were masterclasses in multi-layered defense. So the next time you admire a castle's lush grounds, look closer. Those flowers weren't just pretty, they were the last line of defense before the drawbridge rose. Poison was the medieval elite's weapon of choice precisely because it left no fingerprints, just a quiet, untraceable end that could be blamed on bad humors or divine judgment. In a world where open violence risked rebellion or revenge, a carefully administered toxin was the perfect political tool, and gardens were the ultimate suppliers. Consider the infamous case of King Louis XI of France, who kept a personal poison garden at his chateau, allegedly testing its contents on unsuspecting guests. His courtiers joked that dining with the king was like playing chess with death, every dish a potential gambit. The logistics were disturbingly simple. A noblewoman might pluck a sprig of innocent-looking hemlock during her morning stroll, later grinding its roots into a powder that could disappear into a rival's wine. Apothecaries employed by wealthy patrons discreetly labeled their deadliest concoctions as remedies for melancholy or female troubles, ensuring plausible deniability. Even the church wasn't immune. When Cardinal John Borgia died suddenly after a banquet in 1497, rumors swirled that his own nephew Cesare had slipped cantarella, a family specialty distilled from rotten pork and arsenic, into the sacramental wine. The Vatican's gardens, it was whispered, grew the ingredients. What made poison so effective wasn't just its stealth, but its symbolism. A blade in the dark screamed assassination, but a slow decline. That could be divine retribution or natural causes. When the Duke of Brittany succumbed after eating figs in 1488, no one could prove they'd been stuffed with crushed foxglove seeds, only that his rival, King Louis, had sent the gift basket. Gardens lent legitimacy to these plots. A monarch could publicly admire his prize-winning monkshood while privately stockpiling its toxins, blending menace with horticultural prestige. Women, often barred from wielding swords, became adept at this shadow warfare. Queen Isabella of Castile allegedly planted entire beds of belladonna, its berries nicknamed doll's eyes for their uncanny resemblance to human pupils. Her enemies knew the message. She saw everything. Meanwhile, Italian noblewomen like Lucrezia Borgia perfected the art of the poisoned ring, hiding reservoirs of liquid nightshade behind gemstones, a lethal kiss for any hand they disliked. The true genius of these schemes lay in their ambiguity. Without modern toxicology, poisonings often went unrecognized. A victim's fever might be blamed on miasma, their convulsions on demonic possession. Even when suspicions arose, proof was nearly impossible. By the time a physician thought to check for bitter almonds on the breath, a telltale sign of cyanide, the murderer had already burned their herb gardens, incriminating plants. Yet for all their efficiency, poison gardens carried a double edge. The same nobles who relied on them lived in perpetual fear of their own tables. Banquets became psychological battlegrounds, with tasters sampling every dish and guests discreetly swapping goblets. Some lords grew paranoid, like England's Henry VII, who insisted his food be prepared in a locked kitchen under armed guard, only to die decades later. Historians suspect from a delayed-acting toxin in his communion wafer. In the end, these gardens were more than just suppliers of death. They were mirrors of a society where power demanded both beauty and brutality, where trust was cultivated as carefully as any herb. Walk through a reconstructed medieval garden today, and you'll still feel that tension, the roses too perfect, the herbs too fragrant, because centuries ago, those plants weren't just decorations. They were loaded weapons blooming quietly in the sunlight. The Borgias didn't just dabble in poison, they turned it into an art form. Their infamous cantarella, a toxin rumored to be brewed from decomposing pork and arsenic, allegedly claimed countless lives during Renaissance Italy's cutthroat political games. But the real genius lay in their garden at the Vatican, where lush vines and flowering shrubs concealed the raw ingredients of their plots. Guests admiring the cardinal's prized oleander would never suspect its leaves could slow a pulse to a stop, or that the delicate white blossoms of lily of the valley masked a toxin strong enough to mimic heart failure. For the Borgias, gardening wasn't a hobby, it was a cover for murder. Lesser known but equally sinister was the case of Countess Erzsébet Bathory, the so-called Blood Countess of Hungary. Her castle gardens brimmed with wolfsbane and belladonna, which she reportedly used to silence witnesses to her crimes. Local herb sellers mysteriously vanished after supplying her with rare specimens, their bodies found with traces of monkshood in their veins. The Countess understood something primal. In an era when women wielded little official power, a well-tended poison garden could be the ultimate equalizer. Even royalty wasn't immune. When King Charles VI of France suffered bouts of madness, his physicians prescribed remedies from the palace garden's tonics laced with henbane and mandrake that may have worsened his condition. Centuries later, historians examining his symptoms recognized the telltale signs of deliberate poisoning disguised as treatment. The royal gardeners, it seemed, had been pruning more than just roses. Perhaps the most brazen case came from the Medici court, where a visiting diplomat collapsed after sniffing a bouquet of fragrant Daphne flowers. The blooms themselves were harmless, but their stems had been brushed with a tincture of water hemlock. By the time the victim's attendants thought to check his nose for residue, the offending plants had already been composted. Without evidence, the incident was recorded as a tragic accident, just another mysterious death in a garden full of them. These stories reveal a darker truth. Poison gardens weren't just tools of the powerful. They were great equalizers. A peasant might not own a sword, but they could harvest enough hemlock from a ditch to settle a feud. A scorned wife couldn't challenge her husband openly, but a pinch of crushed foxglove seeds in his ale could do the talking for her. That's what made them so terrifying, their democracy. Behind every castle wall and cottage fence, the same plants grew, waiting for someone desperate enough to use them. The legacy of these gardens lingers in our language. When we call something bittersweet, we're nodding to the deadly nightshade Solanum dulcamara, whose berries taste deceptively sweet before the poison takes hold. The phrase, "paint the lily," comes from the practice of gilding lily of the valley stems to warn of their toxicity. Even our fairy tales are haunted by these plants. Think of Snow White's apple, or the enchanted briars that protect sleeping princesses. The medieval garden wasn't just a place of beauty, it was the original crime scene where every petal cast a shadow. What makes a seemingly harmless plant so deadly? The answer lies in the invisible warfare waged by toxins at the cellular level. Take monkshood, the medieval murderer's favorite. Its vibrant blue flowers contain aconitine, a compound so potent it disrupts sodium channels in nerves, causing muscles to fire uncontrollably until the victim suffocates, a death medieval observers described as the body fighting itself. Victims reportedly felt ants crawling beneath their skin before paralysis set in, a horrifying detail that made the plant both feared and revered. Then there's water hemlock, often mistaken for wild parsley. Its toxin, cytotoxin, attacks the central nervous system with terrifying efficiency. One bite of the root triggers violent seizures as the brain's neurons misfire uncontrollably. Ancient accounts describe victims foaming at the mouth, their limbs thrashing like puppets with cut strings. What made it especially sinister was its latency. Symptoms could take hours to appear, leaving no obvious link between the meal and the convulsions. But perhaps the most insidious was arsenic, disguised as harmless white powder in medieval apothecaries. Unlike plant toxins that triggered dramatic symptoms, arsenic disrupted cellular energy production at a glacial pace. A victim might complain of stomach pains and fatigue for months before their organs quietly shut down. This slow, untraceable decline made it the perfect tool for dynastic schemers, a whisper of death disguised as natural illness. The true genius of medieval poisoners lay in their observational precision. Without knowing biochemistry, they catalogued effects with chilling accuracy. A healer might note that wolfsbane caused coldness in the limbs and breath like winter, recognizing peripheral nervous shutdown. Or they'd record that belladonna dilated pupils by mimicking acetylcholine, calling it the devil's trick to steal sight. These practitioners were the first toxicologists conducting trial and error with lethal stakes. Delivery methods showcased equal ingenuity. Toxins were baked into communion wafers, dissolved in scented oils for poisoned gloves, or even brushed onto book pages, a deadly surprise for licked fingers turning parchment. Some assassins exploited seasonal changes. Autumn crocus bulbs harvested in spring contained 10 times more colchicine, perfect for ensuring a noble's sudden decline after winter's lean rations. What's most haunting is how these methods persist. Modern medicine still uses digitalis from foxglove for heart patients, and chemotherapy drugs derived from the same yew trees that once tipped assassins' arrows. The line between poison and remedy remains as thin as a medieval scribe's parchment and just as easily torn. In a world where women were barred from courts and battlefields, gardens became their secret arsenals. While men brandished swords, women wielded something far subtler, the quiet power of plants. A noblewoman's herb garden might boast chamomile for tea and rosemary for roasting meats, but tucked between those harmless sprouts could be a cluster of belladonna, its berries glistening like forbidden jewels. This duality was no accident. For women denied formal authority, poison offered control without confrontation, a way to reshape destinies from the shadows. Take the case of the infamous Marquise de Brinvilliers in 17th century France. Though slightly post-medieval, her methods were straight from the poison garden playbook. She hosted lavish dinners, serving dishes laced with arsenic refined from her own laboratory, a room disguised as a perfumery. Her victims died agonizing deaths, their symptoms dismissed as fever. What made her so terrifying wasn't just her crimes, but how perfectly she embodied society's deepest fear, that the gentle hand stirring the pot could also be measuring the dose. The link between women, herbs, and witchcraft wasn't mere superstition. It was a deliberate smear. Midwives who used ergot to ease childbirth pains risked accusations of devilry if the line between medicine and poison blurred. A village wise woman might save a child with foxglove tea, now known to regulate heartbeats, only to be burned as a witch if the dosage erred. This persecution served a purpose. It suppressed female knowledge. By equating herbalism with heresy, patriarchal systems could dismantle women's autonomy over their own bodies and communities. Yet some women weaponized these stereotypes. Italian courtier Isabella Cortes published a Book of Secrets in the 1560s, filled with seemingly innocent beauty recipes. Between instructions for rosewater and hair dyes, she tucked formulas for undetectable poisons, knowing male scholars would dismiss it as frivolous women's work. Meanwhile, German abbess Hildegard von Bingen encoded toxicology notes within her religious writings, trusting that men wouldn't scrutinize a nun's piety too closely. The class divide was stark. Peasant women might harvest hemlock to end an abusive marriage, while noble women like Catherine de Medici employed royal botanists to craft poisons for statecraft. Catherine's infamous flying squadron of ladies-in-waiting reportedly carried perfumed sachets laced with toxins to eliminate political nuisances. For every woman burned as a witch, there was a duchess smiling behind her fan, knowing her garden held deadlier secrets than any inquisitor's dungeon. Perhaps the most tragic irony was how society both relied on and reviled women's botanical expertise. The same village healer who cured fevers with willow bark, a natural aspirin, could be condemned for knowing which mushrooms induced visions or death. This double standard turned gardens into battlegrounds. A woman tending her plot wasn't just growing food, she was navigating a minefield of suspicion, where parsley could be proof of virtue or evidence of villainy, depending on who did the judging. The legacy of these women lingers in our language. The word venom shares roots with Venus, the goddess of love, a nod to the ancient connection between femininity and fatal potions. Even today, calling a woman poisonous carries echoes of medieval fears, but peel back the stigma and you'll find a darker truth. These women weren't monsters. They were strategists, survivors, and sometimes saviors, turning the only weapons they were allowed into tools of rebellion. Their gardens weren't just plots of dirt. They were statements rooted in silence, blooming in defiance. A single sprig of belladonna tucked into a medieval painting wasn't just decoration, it was a silent scream. Artists wielded poisonous plants like visual code, embedding layers of meaning in their work. Take the Annunciation scenes where lilies symbolized purity, but a subtle cluster of nightshade in the background whispered of future betrayal. This duality wasn't accidental. Medieval minds saw nature as a mirror of human morality, where every plant held a lesson. A rose's thorns warned of love's pain, while wolfsbane's vibrant blooms signaled hidden peril. These weren't just botanical details, they were moral compasses rendered in petals and leaves. Literature amplified these symbols. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, a character poisoned by a herb wasn't merely a plot device, it was a commentary on deception's sweet allure. The poison apple in Snow White traces its roots to medieval herbals, where red fruit often symbolized temptation with fatal consequences. Even religious texts got in on the act. Manuscripts depicted Eden's serpent coiled around mandrake roots, linking the fall of man to humanity's obsession with forbidden knowledge. The message was clear: danger often wore a beautiful face. But the symbolism ran deeper than simple warnings. Poison gardens became metaphors for the human soul. A well-tended plot of medicinal herbs represented virtue, while unchecked growth of hemlock mirrored moral decay. This thinking bled into architecture too. Cloisters featured carved capitals with vines choking saints, a stone reminder that corruption could strangle piety. The infamous Hortus Conclusus enclosed garden motif took on sinister undertakes when filled with toxic species. What began as a symbol of Virgin Mary's purity became, in some contexts, a gilded cage of secrets. The most chilling symbolism emerged in heraldry. Certain noble families adopted poisonous plants into their coats of arms, not despite their toxicity, but because of it. The Borgia's emblem included laurel, a nod to Apollo, but also a plant whose crushed leaves release cyanide. Likewise, the Medici crest's 5 balls were rumored to represent deadly nightshade berries. These weren't subtle choices. Like a dragon on a shield, they broadcasted power through fear. What fascinates modern scholars is how these symbols transcended class. Peasant folklore warned children away from elf cups, fly agaric mushrooms with tales of fairy curses, while tapestries in castles depicted unicorns purifying water with wolfsbane-laced horns. The shared visual language bound society together in a collective understanding. Beauty could be a weapon, and nature never gave gifts without strings. Today, we've lost much of this layered thinking. When we see foxglove in a medieval manuscript, we admire its delicate bells, not the cardiac glycosides humming beneath its petals. But next time you spot a painted violet in a book of hours, look closer. That demure flower might just be the medieval equivalent of a skull and crossbones, a pretty reminder that even paradise has its serpents. Poison might have been the perfect crime in theory, but getting away with it came with its own risks because if you were caught, the punishments were brutal beyond imagination. Medieval lawmakers knew they were dealing with a weapon that left no visible wounds, so they designed consequences to match the horror of the act itself. In England, the punishment for convicted poisoners was to be boiled alive, a sentence so gruesome it was reserved only for the worst offenses. Records from the reign of Henry VIII describe one such execution, where a cook who poisoned his master's family was lowered into a vat of scalding water in Smithfield Market, a spectacle meant to terrify others into thinking twice before slipping something sinister into the stew. The legal system faced a paradox, though. While poisoning was universally condemned, proving it was nearly impossible without modern forensic tools, suspicious deaths might be chalked up to bad air or divine punishment, leaving many killers to walk free. This frustration led to some bizarre legal innovations. In Venice, the Council of Ten, the Republic's shadowy ruling body, kept a secret ledger of suspected poisoners, bypassing traditional courts altogether. If enough whispers pointed to a noble's guilt, they might simply vanish during the night, their body found floating in the canals with no official explanation. Justice here wasn't about proof, it was about sending a message. Religious authorities took an even darker approach. The church declared poisoning a sin against God's natural order, branding it as murder by stealth. Confessors were instructed to grill penitents about any knowledge of herbs or potions, turning the sacrament of confession into an inquisition. In some regions, merely possessing wolfsbane or hemlock could land you on a pyre, accused of witchcraft before you'd even harmed a soul. The line between herbalist and heretic became dangerously thin, especially for women. Yet the laws often backfired in unexpected ways. When Frederick II of Sicily made poisoning a capital crime in the 1300s, he inadvertently created a market for untraceable toxins. Apothecaries began selling safe, poisoned substances that mimicked natural illnesses so perfectly that even court physicians couldn't detect them. The very attempt to regulate poison birthed a new era of sophistication among criminals. The ultimate irony, some of the harshest anti-poisoning laws were written by rulers who used toxins themselves. Emperor Nero famously executed his rivals with a team of court poisoners while publicly condemning the practice. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on the populace. Pamphlets circulated in medieval markets joked that the only real crime was getting caught because in the shadows of power, poison remained the great equalizer. A peasant boiled alive for killing a lord might find grim comfort knowing a duke's wife had used the same method to dispatch her husband's mistress, just with better connections to cover her tracks. What emerges from these tangled legal histories isn't just a story of crime and punishment, but a window into medieval anxiety. Poison threatened the very idea of order. It was violence without honor, death without confrontation. The draconian responses reveal how deeply it unnerved those in power, because in a world where a single berry could topple a dynasty, the law's brutality was the only shield they had left. The gardens of the medieval elite weren't just for show, they were laboratories of cruelty, where the powerful tested their deadliest creations. Picture a nobleman strolling past cages of rabbits or pigeons, each one fed a carefully measured dose of hemlock or belladonna. Their twitching limbs and labored breaths told him everything he needed to know: how much would kill a man, how quickly, and with what symptoms. These weren't idle experiments. They were dress rehearsals for murder, conducted with the same detachment as a chef tasting soup before serving it to guests. Servants often became unwilling participants in these trials. A disloyal footman might find himself rewarded with a goblet of wine just slightly sweeter than usual, only to collapse hours later in convulsions. The Lord would note the timing, the coloration of the skin, the sounds of agony, all valuable data for future use. Some castles even had hidden gardens behind the kitchens, where herbs were cultivated and tested far from prying eyes. The staff knew better than to ask why the scullery maid who sampled the new tonic never returned. What's chilling is how clinical these practices became. Records from the court of Cesare Borgia describe a taster's log, where servants recorded every symptom of their own poisoning in excruciating detail before antidotes were administered. These accounts read like medieval clinical trials, complete with dosage notes and efficacy ratings. The line between science and savagery blurred entirely when lives were treated as disposable data points. Animals faced even grimmer fates. Falcons, prized for their nobility, were sometimes fed tainted meat to gauge how quickly a toxin would act in a creature of similar size to a human. Peasants spoke of nobles releasing poisoned bread for stray dogs near their estates, timing how long it took for the animals to succumb. These macabre tests weren't just about potency, they were about precision. A duke couldn't afford his rival coughing blood at a public banquet. The death needed to resemble illness, not foul play. The psychological impact was just as calculated. When a servant survived a test but suffered permanent tremors or blindness, their condition served as a walking warning to others. A single gardener with a palsied hand could silence an entire household's gossip. Some lords took perverse pride in their garden's reputation, knowing fear grew as readily as the wolfsbane in their flower beds, yet these experiments occasionally backfired. In 1523, a German countess accidentally poisoned herself while testing a new concoction on a chicken. The bird pecked her finger, introducing enough toxin to kill her within hours. Other nobles found their own tasters turning against them, using their knowledge to spike their masters' meals. The poison garden, it seemed, was a double-edged sword. Those who cultivated death often reaped it themselves. What's most unsettling is how these practices mirrored legitimate science. Monastic herbalists used similar methods, testing small doses on animals to develop life-saving remedies. The same techniques that could cure a fever could also ensure a rival's demise. This duality captures the essence of the medieval world, a place where knowledge was power and power demanded sacrifices. So the next time you see a painting of a nobleman admiring his garden, look closer. Those roses might not be the only things with thorns. By the 17th century, the poison garden's golden age was withering away. The rise of forensic science turned what was once the perfect crime into a perilous gamble. Autopsies grew more sophisticated. Physicians learned to spot the telltale signs of arsenic poisoning, like the garlicky odor of a corpse or the unnatural preservation of organs. Courts began demanding evidence beyond rumors, and suddenly, that carefully cultivated patch of monkshood in the castle courtyard became less of an asset and more of a liability. Nobles who once flaunted their toxic botanicals now hurried to uproot them, lest a rival's sudden death lead investigators straight to their herb beds. Medicine's evolution also played a role. As apothecaries standardized dosages and published pharmacopoeias, the line between remedy and poison became clearer and harder to exploit. A physician could no longer claim a fatal dose of digitalis was an honest mistake when printed guides listed its lethal threshold. Even the church, once a keeper of herbal secrets, began condemning unsanctioned remedies, pushing plant-based cures into the realm of licensed professionals. The same knowledge that had empowered medieval healers now shackled them to oversight and scrutiny. Political shifts sealed the poison garden's fate. The rise of centralized governments meant power was no longer seized through shadowy dinners or tainted wine, but through laws and treaties. A king might still fear assassination, but now he worried about pistols, not petals. The Borgia's infamous cantarella couldn't compete with a well-placed musket ball. Meanwhile, the Enlightenment's emphasis on transparency made covert killings seem archaic. Why risk poisoning a rival when you could bankrupt him in court or outmaneuver him in parliament? Yet these gardens didn't vanish overnight. Some lingered as morbid curiosities. The Hortus Botanicus in Leyden, founded in 1590, initially included a section of toxic plants for educational purposes, though whispers persisted that certain specimens were still harvested for darker uses. Other poison gardens downsized, their deadliest occupants replaced with exotic but harmless blooms to satisfy the era's growing fascination with botany as a science rather than a weapon. The legacy of these gardens, though, is anything but extinct. Modern toxicology textbooks still feature medieval plants like belladonna and hemlock, now studied for their chemical properties rather than their murder potential. Historical reenactments and TV dramas keep the intrigue alive, portraying poisoners with a mix of horror and perverse admiration. And let's not forget tourism today. Visitors flock to places like England's Alnwick Garden, where a dedicated poison garden behind iron gates lets them safely gawk at plants that once toppled empires. What's fascinating is how these gardens reflect humanity's enduring duality. We've traded hemlock for herbicides and arsenic for antibiotics, but the core tension remains. Nature can heal or harm, depending on who holds the knowledge. The poison garden's decline wasn't just about science or politics. It was about a world learning, painfully, that some secrets are too dangerous to keep. Yet even now, when we stroll past a patch of foxglove or admire a yew tree's red berries, there's a whisper of that old wariness, because deep down we know beauty and peril have always grown side by side. Centuries after medieval poison gardens faded into obscurity, modern researchers are peeling back the layers of history to expose their deadly secrets. Archaeologists working at sites like the Abbey of St. Gall have uncovered soil samples laced with traces of hemlock and wolfsbane, proving these plants weren't just myths, they were cultivated with purpose. In the shadow of crumbling monastery walls, scientists using chemical analysis have detected arsenic residues in herb beds, suggesting some healing gardens doubled as discrete poison factories. These discoveries rewrite our understanding of medieval horticulture. revealing it as a high-stakes science where beauty and lethality grew side by side. Manuscripts once dismissed as superstition are now being re-evaluated with fresh eyes. A 13th century text called the Book of Poisons, long considered folklore, was recently proven accurate when chemists recreated its recipes. One formula for invisible wine matched the symptoms of modern aconitine poisoning perfectly: muscle paralysis, tingling skin, and eventual cardiac arrest. Historians poring over household accounts from English castles have found suspicious payments to gardeners for special herbs, alongside orders for exotic blooms. The paper trail suggests nobility maintained dual gardening budgets, one for public displays, another for private plots with darker purposes. This revival of interest isn't just academic, it's reshaping how we see historical events. The sudden death of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in 1250, once attributed to dysentery, now seems suspicious after researchers found his personal physician's notes referencing experimental doses of autumn crocus. Similarly, the mass poisoning at a French banquet in 1314 makes grisly sense when viewed through the lens of newly discovered kitchen garden plans showing water hemlock planted conspicuously near the parsley. The most fascinating aspect of this research is how it bridges medieval and modern science. Laboratories are now testing whether ancient poison antidotes actually worked, and some do. A Saxon remedy combining crushed emerald and vinegar, once mocked as medieval quackery, has been shown to bind with arsenic compounds, potentially saving lives. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical companies study monkshood toxins for painkiller applications, proving these deadly plants still hold value when handled with care. Tourism has embraced this dark legacy too. Visitors to Italy's Orto Botanico di Padova can walk among descendants of the same belladonna plants that might have supplied Renaissance poisoners. England's Alnwick Poison Garden, with its iron gates warning "These plants can kill," educates thousands annually about the thin line between medicine and murder. The guides there don't just recite facts, they tell stories of real people who lived and died by these plants, making history feel chillingly immediate. Perhaps the ultimate irony is how these rediscoveries mirror medieval practices. Just as monks once documented plant properties in coded manuscripts, modern researchers publish papers on toxicology databases, both groups understanding that knowledge, once gained, can never truly be lost. The difference: today's scientists wear protective gloves when handling what medieval gardeners cultivated barehanded, proving that while our fascination with these deadly plants endures, our survival instincts have thankfully improved. The debate over whether to resurrect medieval poison gardens isn't just academic, it's a moral minefield. On one side, historians argue that growing these deadly plants could unlock lost knowledge, offering insights into how medieval healers walked the razor's edge between cure and kill. Imagine replicating the exact conditions of a 15th century monastic garden, where monks cultivated wolfsbane alongside chamomile. Such an experiment might reveal how they calibrated dosages with nothing but intuition, turning guesswork into a science. But here's the catch: what if that knowledge fell into the wrong hands? A single mislabeled specimen could turn a research greenhouse into a criminal's toolkit. Ethicists raise even thornier questions. Is it responsible to revive toxins like hemlock, which claimed countless lives, even in the name of education? Modern labs studying these plants operate under strict security, gloved hands, locked doors, and surveillance, yet medieval gardens were anything but controlled. They thrived in the open, their dangers hidden in plain sight. Recreating that authenticity would mean abandoning modern safeguards, a gamble few institutions are willing to take. The irony is palpable. We're drawn to these gardens precisely because they were so perilous, yet we can't fully replicate them without courting disaster. Then there's the issue of cultural respect. Many poison plants held sacred roles in medieval society, belladonna in pagan rituals, mandrake in folk magic. To grow them as mere curiosities risks reducing centuries of tradition to a macabre exhibit. Scholars in Iceland faced backlash when they proposed cultivating a replica of a Viking-era poison garden, complete with henbane and monkshood. Indigenous groups argued these plants weren't historical props but ancestors' tools, deserving reverence, not revival. The project was shelved, a reminder that the past isn't always ours to reconstruct. Yet the potential rewards are undeniable. In Germany, a team cautiously cultivating medieval nightshade varieties discovered a previously unknown alkaloid that could lead to breakthrough painkillers. Another study found that arsenic-resistant herbs from historic gardens might help clean up polluted soil. These breakthroughs hinge on walking in the footsteps of medieval gardeners, literally planting their poisons to uncover their secrets. The dilemma echoes the old adage, just because we can, does it mean we should? Perhaps the answer lies in balance. Some institutions, like the Poison Garden at Elnwick Castle, grow these plants behind bars literally. Visitors peer through iron gates at thriving belladonna, their berries glistening ominously, while guides emphasize the line between history and hazard. It's a compromise, honoring the past without unleashing it. Other researchers use 3D modeling to recreate medieval gardens virtually, studying their layouts without risking a single toxic leaf. Technology might offer a way to have our cake and not eat it too, or in this case, to examine the cake without accidentally baking one laced with arsenic. The conversation isn't just about plants, it's about how we confront history's darker chapters. Do we lock them away as cautionary tales or handle them with care, hoping to glean wisdom from their venom? Either way, the Poison Garden's legacy refuses to wither. Its shadows stretch into our labs, our ethics boards, and our collective imagination, a reminder that some roots, once planted, are impossible to fully uproot. Shakespeare knew the power of a poisoned garden long before historians uncovered their dark truths. In Hamlet, the murderous King Claudius slips henbane into his brother's ear, a toxin so potent it curdles blood, like eager droppings into milk. The bard didn't invent this detail. He borrowed it from real medieval herbals where henbane was notorious for causing delirium and death. This interplay between fact and fiction runs deep. When Ophelia hands out rosemary for remembrance and fennel for flattery, she's not just weaving a floral metaphor, she's echoing the dual-purpose gardens of monasteries where every plant held a secret. Modern thrillers amplify this legacy. Think of The Name of the Rose, where Umberto Eco's medieval library hides a book with poisoned pages, its ink laced with deadly nightshade. Or the Red Queen series, where noblewomen train in herbology as deftly as swordplay, their perfumed sachets concealing wolfsbane. These stories aren't pure fantasy, they're rooted in the realpolitik of medieval courts, where a woman's worth was measured in dowries and discreetly administered tonics. Even children's literature isn't immune. Harry Potter's venomous tentacula and screaming mandrakes owe their existence to medieval herbals that described plants as sentient, even sinister beings. What makes these portrayals so compelling is their grain of truth. The infamous Poison Garden in Game of Thrones, where House Tyrell cultivates the Strangler, mirrors the Borgia's real-life Cantarella plots. When Olenna Tyrell quips, "I've known a great many clever men, I've outlived them all," she channels centuries of noblewomen who turned herbology into survival strategy. Pop culture didn't invent the trope of the deadly bloom, it merely polished the thorns. Yet fiction often exaggerates for drama. Medieval poisoners rarely dealt in instant-kill toxins. Most took hours or days to act, a nuance lost in Snow White's apple or Sleeping Beauty's spindle. Modern audiences love the quick collapse, the dramatic gasp, but history favors slower, subtler endings. The real horror of medieval poisoning wasn't the theatrics, but the uncertainty. Was your headache from fatigue or foxglove? Your nausea from bad meat or belladonna? This psychological terror, where every meal might be your last, is harder to capture on screen. The Poison Garden's literary evolution reveals something profound. We're still grappling with the same fears as medieval minds. When a detective in a crime novel sniffs a victim's wine for bitter almonds, a telltale sign of cyanide, they're employing 500-year-old toxicology. Our fascination endures because these stories remind us that danger often wears a pretty face. So next time you see a villainous pruning roses on screen, look closer. Those shears in her hand, they're not just for show. Every deadly plant in a medieval poison garden got its start not as a weapon, but as a survivor. Take the vibrant foxglove. Those bell-shaped flowers didn't evolve to kill kings. They developed digitalis toxins to stop hungry deer from devouring their leaves. Nature's irony is thick here. The very compounds that made these plants unpalatable to grazing animals became the same ones human hands would later harvest to still a rival's heartbeat. This arms race between plant and predator took millennia, with toxins growing more sophisticated as herbivores developed resistances. A patch of hemlock isn't just poisonous, it's a masterpiece of biochemical warfare, honed over generations to outwit everything from insects to mammals. The science behind these defenses is chillingly precise. Monkshood's aconitine, for example, targets nerve cells so specifically that medieval assassins could calculate a victim's time of death down to the hour. But in the wild, this precision serves a different purpose. The plant's blue-hooded flowers attract specialized pollinators, bumblebees heavy enough to trigger the stamens without being harmed, while deterring clumsy beetles that would damage its delicate structures. What humans weaponized as a paralytic was, to the monkshood, just a way to keep its pollen safe for the right partners. Even the infamous deadly nightshade, with its alluring black berries, didn't evolve them for human temptation. The fruits are perfectly calibrated to attract birds, creatures unaffected by the toxins, who then disperse the seeds far and wide. Our ancestors simply stumbled into a chemical conversation between plants and animals that had been ongoing for eons. Some of these toxins reveal even darker ecological strategies. Water hemlock cytotoxin, one of nature's most violent convulsants, likely developed as a soil antibiotic, a way for the plant to kill competing roots in waterlogged marshes. The poison that could fell a medieval duke was really just a botanical turf war gone viral. Similarly, arsenic-accumulating plants like brake ferns didn't set out to poison wells. They were mining toxic soil elements to deter leaf-munching insects, turning their own tissues into tiny landmines. When humans discovered these adaptations, we didn't just borrow them, we turbocharged them. Where a plant might produce trace toxins as a deterrent, we cultivated strains with 10 times the potency, turning subtle defense mechanisms into weapons of mass destruction. The bitterest twist, many of these plants relied on humans for their survival. Medieval monks propagating belladonna for eye medicine unwittingly became the plant's most effective dispersal agents, spreading it far beyond its native range. The same hands that documented its deadly properties in herbals also ensured its legacy would endure. Even today, patches of poison hemlock thriving near ruined monasteries stand as silent witnesses to this twisted symbiosis, nature's killers preserved by the very cultures they helped destroy. Understanding this evolutionary backstory changes how we see poison gardens. They're not just collections of deadly plants, but museums of biological ingenuity, places where humanity hijacked millions of years of natural innovation for its own ends. The next time you see a medieval painting of a garden, look beyond the beauty. Those flowers aren't just growing, they're negotiating, surviving, and occasionally, with human help, committing murder. While European nobles were slipping hemlock into their rivals' wine halfway across the world, Islamic scholars were revolutionizing poison's role in medicine. The contrast couldn't be starker. In Baghdad's House of Wisdom, physicians like al-Razi classified toxins not as weapons, but as tools for healing, recording how minute doses of arsenic could treat fevers or how aconite might ease joint pain when diluted. Their gardens weren't shadowy plots but open-air pharmacies where deadly plants were studied under the blazing sun rather than whispered about in castle corridors. This wasn't just cultural difference, it was a philosophical divide. Where Europeans saw poison as a political lever, Islamic scholars approached it as another facet of Allah's creation, to be understood rather than feared. Travel further east and the story shifts again. In China's imperial gardens, toxic plants like monkshood and ginseng grew side by side, embodying the delicate balance of yin and yang. Emperors employed herbalists to manipulate this duality, using wolfsbane in controlled doses to boost vitality, while keeping antidotes like licorice root on hand to counteract overdoses. Poison wasn't just a threat or a remedy, it was energy to be harnessed like floodwaters diverted into irrigation channels. Court records from the Tang dynasty describe elaborate testing pavilions where new botanical combinations were tried on prisoners, not for cruelty's sake, but to refine dosages that might later save lives. The same garden that supplied an assassin's dagger could also stock the emperor's tea with longevity elixirs. India's traditions carved yet another path. Ayurvedic texts like the Sushruta Samhita detailed over 50 poisonous plants, but with a twist. Each toxin had its shadow herb, a natural antidote cultivated in adjacent plots. A garden might feature deadly datura vines twining around neem trees, the very bark that could neutralize their venom. This wasn't happenstance, it was choreography. Unlike Europe's secretive poison gardens, these spaces were designed for transparency, teaching physicians to recognize both danger and cure in a single glance. Even the layout held meaning. Toxins planted to the north associated with the god Kubera, keeper of wealth, symbolized their value when used wisely, not just their capacity for harm. The differences extended to folklore. While European peasants told tales of witches brewing hemlock in cauldrons, Japanese legends spoke of Yamabushi monks who trained with toxic aconite to endure pain during spiritual trials. Persian poets likened love to belladonna, beautiful yet perilous, while Mesoamerican glyphs depicted gods holding blooming oleander as symbols of transformation. These weren't just decorative metaphors, they reflected how deeply poison gardens were woven into each culture's worldview. What unites these traditions isn't their methods, but their reverence for nature's duality. Whether displayed behind palace gates or studied in monastic courtyards, these plants forced humanity to confront a fundamental truth: creation and destruction grow from the same root. The next time you see a medieval herbal manuscript, remember the same page that warned of nightshade's lethality might also hold the recipe for an antidote. Survival wasn't about avoiding poison, it was about learning its language, and that lesson, it seems, was written in every culture's soil. A nobleman didn't need to lace your wine with hemlock to ruin your day. Sometimes all it took was a well-placed whisper. Did you hear about the Duke's garden? A servant might murmur at market. They say the roses there weep poison. Whether the story was true hardly mattered. The mere suggestion that a lord cultivated toxic plants could send rivals second-guessing every banquet invitation, every offered goblet, every bouquet delivered to their chambers. This was psychological warfare at its most elegant. No blades drawn, no blood spilled, just the slow creep of paranoia taking root. Take the case of Countess Matilda of Tuscany in the 11th century. Though her gardens were likely no deadlier than any other noble's, she let rumors flourish that her prized oleander could kill with a touch. The effect was instant. Ambassadors from rival city-states suddenly developed illnesses when summoned to her court, and even her allies hesitated to offend her. The Countess understood something profound. A garden's true power wasn't just in its poisons, but in the theater surrounding them. A single locked gate leading to an off-limits herb plot became more terrifying than a battalion of knights when imaginations ran wild. Kings weaponized this ambiguity too. When Henry VIII's ministers spread word that the royal gardens at Whitehall contained plants from the devil's own orchard, it wasn't just superstition, it was strategy. Foreign envoys dining under those yew trees found themselves refusing second helpings, their appetites spoiled by visions of tainted meat. The genius lay in plausible deniability. Henry could chuckle and call the rumors nonsense while his enemies agonized over whether the fig they'd just eaten would be their last. Even monastery walls couldn't contain the dread. Abbots known for their herbal expertise often found themselves accused of dark arts, their carefully tended gardens viewed as cursed ground. In some cases, this reputation worked in their favor. When the abbot of Cluny hinted that his infirmary grew plants not fit for the ungodly, local bandits suddenly stopped raiding the monastery stores. A few strategically placed warning signs, a skull carved into a garden marker, a faded fresco of sinners choking on berries, turned cultivation into intimidation. The psychological impact rippled down to everyday life. Peasants avoided certain hedgerows rumored to be planted by vengeful lords. Traveling minstrels sang ballads about lovers betrayed by poisoned posies, reinforcing the idea that even romance could be fatal. This wasn't just fear, it was a cultural narrative reinforced by design. Noble families commissioned tapestries showing their ancestors surveying gardens brimming with wolfsbane and mandrake, subtly reminding visitors that their hospitality came with teeth. What's fascinating is how these tactics blurred the line between myth and reality. Some lords likely exaggerated their gardens' dangers, while others downplayed genuinely lethal plots. The uncertainty itself became the weapon. After all, a knight might brave a sword fight, but even the bravest soul hesitates before sipping wine in a hall where every vine on the walls might be plotting against him. This legacy lingers in our language. When we say someone has a poisonous personality, we're echoing the medieval belief that malice could seep into the soil itself. Modern politicians still speak of planting seeds of doubt, unaware they're quoting a strategy older than castles. The next time you walk through a beautiful garden, pause and consider sometimes the sharpest thorns are the ones you never see. The moment a noble suspected poisoning, the race was on not just to identify the toxin, but to find something, anything, that might counter its effects. Medieval antidotes were a bizarre mix of brilliant intuition and desperate guesswork, where crushed emeralds shared shelf space with powdered unicorn horn, which was usually just narwhal tusk. Some remedies actually worked. The ancient Greeks knew charcoal could absorb certain toxins, a principle still used in modern emergency rooms, but other cures were pure theater, like the infamous bezoar stones, calcified lumps from animal stomachs believed to neutralize all poisons. King Charles IX of France reportedly paid a fortune for one, wearing it as a pendant against assassination. Its actual effectiveness about as reliable as a chocolate shield. Monastic infirmaries developed some of the most sophisticated antidotes, blending herbal wisdom with trial and error. A 10th century manuscript from Monte Cassino lists a wolfsbane antidote containing vinegar and salt, a crude but functional approach since acidity can break down alkaloids. Other monasteries swore by Mithridatium, a legendary concoction of 54 ingredients including opium and dried viper, named after King Mithridates, who supposedly immunized himself by ingesting tiny doses of poison daily. The recipe varied wildly between regions. Some versions contained saffron and cinnamon, turning antidotes into status symbols. Wealthy patrons would commission personalized batches, their gold-leafed jars as much about display as survival. The line between remedy and ritual often blurred. When a Saxon text recommended pressing a live dove against a poisoning victim's stomach to draw out the venom, it wasn't just superstition. The warmth might soothe cramps, while the ceremony calmed panic. Similarly, drinking powdered gemstones seems absurd until you consider some minerals like malachite contain copper salts that can counteract certain toxins. Even the most outlandish cures reveal medieval minds grappling with biochemistry centuries before microscopes. A Persian physician's note that milk thistle revives the liver after foul humors aligns with modern knowledge of its liver protecting silymarin compounds. Yet for every glimmer of insight, there were deadly missteps. Many antidotes accidentally doubled down on the poisoning. Treating arsenic exposure with mercury, a common practice, created a toxic cocktail that ravaged kidneys. Some healers prescribed vomiting for every toxin, unaware that convulsants like strychnine become deadlier when retched up. The tragic irony: a well-meaning physician often finished what the poison started. What's striking is how these antidotes mirrored their era's contradictions. A world that grew poison gardens also cultivated their cures, often in the same soil. The same abbey that supplied monkshood for assassins might distill digitalis to steady a failing heart. This duality captures the medieval mind at its most pragmatic. Nature was neither good nor evil, but a tool. And like any tool, its worth depended on the hands that wielded it. So the next time you see an illuminated manuscript's painted herbs, look closer. Those vibrant inks might just hide the fingerprints of history's first toxicologists, scribbling survival notes in the margins of oblivion. Alchemists didn't just seek gold, they hunted immortality, and poison gardens were their unlikely laboratories. Hidden behind monastery walls or tucked into castle courtyards, these spaces buzzed with experiments that blurred the lines between botany and magic. Take the infamous Albertus Magnus, a 13th century scholar who wrote extensively on the vegetable mercury found in plants like monkshood. To him, its paralyzing toxins weren't just deadly, they were a coded message from nature, a clue to unlocking eternal life. His manuscripts describe distilling wolfsbane under specific lunar phases, believing its essence could purify the soul as readily as it stopped the heart. This wasn't mere superstition, it was a radical fusion of observation and mysticism, where every lethal petal held cosmic significance. The allure lay in paradox. Alchemists saw poison as the ultimate test of their art, a substance that could kill or cure depending on preparation. The same belladonna berries that dispatched enemies might, in minuscule doses, induce visions of divine truth. Records from the court of Rudolf II describe a secret garden in Prague where alchemists cultivated mandrake roots, whispering incantations as they harvested them at midnight. These rituals weren't just theater, they reflected a genuine belief that toxicity and transcendence were two sides of the same coin. When an alchemist labeled a vial dragon's blood, they weren't just naming a plant resin, they were invoking its power to bridge the mortal and the sublime. Some pursuits turned lethally literal. The legendary Basil Valentine, a shadowy figure linked to early chemistry, allegedly drank diluted arsenic to harden his body against death. His writings describe poison gardens as crucibles for human transformation, where adepts would ingest trace toxins to become immune, a medieval precursor to vaccination gone horribly right. Not all survived these trials. The grave of one anonymous alchemist in Bologna bears an inscription. He sought the elixir in the petals but found only the grave. Yet amid the mysticism, flashes of real science emerged. Alchemists were the first to note that some toxins lost potency when heated, or that combining them with certain metals neutralized their effects. Their cryptic symbols for plants like hemlock and henbane evolved into the warning labels of modern toxicology. Even their failures were instructive when an experiment proved deadly. They documented every twitch and gasp, unknowingly laying groundwork for forensic medicine. The darkest irony, some of their elixirs accidentally worked. A recipe in the Rosarium Philosophorum calls for steeping gold in aqua regia with crushed yew needles, a process that, unbeknownst to the alchemist, created compounds similar to today's chemotherapy drugs. Others stumbled onto antidotes by sheer persistence, like the Venetian adept who discovered that clay could bind to arsenic after watching pigeons eat dirt following poisoned feed. By the Renaissance, poison gardens had become alchemy's open secret. Queen Elizabeth's astrologer John Dee grew mandrakes in Mortlake, while the Medici family funded hidden herbariums where alchemists tested toxins on condemned prisoners. The line between scholar and sorcerer thinned. Paracelsus, the father of toxicology, famously declared, "The dose makes the poison," even as he penned treatises on using mercury to commune with spirits. What remains is the haunting question: were these men fools, visionaries, or something in between? Their gardens held both murder and miracle, often in the same flowerbed. Perhaps that's the alchemist's true legacy, not gold or immortality, but the realization that nature's deadliest secrets might also be its most profound gifts. A rustling in the poison garden after dark wasn't just the wind. It was the mandrake root screaming as it was uprooted, or so medieval folklore claimed. These stories weren't just campfire tales, they were survival guides wrapped in superstition. Take the infamous mandrake with its human-like roots. Manuscripts warned that harvesting it required a dog tied to the plant, lest the collector drop dead from its shrieks. The truth, the root does contain hallucinogens, and digging it up after consuming it might explain the screams as the harvester's own delirium. But the legend served a practical purpose, scaring the uninitiated away from a plant that could, in fact, kill you if prepared wrong. Wolfsbane's reputation was even more theatrical. Its vibrant purple flowers were said to repel werewolves, leading villagers to plant it around cottages, not realizing the real threat wasn't mythical creatures, but the plant's own paralytic toxins. The werewolf connection likely stemmed from its use in ancient berserker rituals, where warriors rubbed it on weapons to induce a battle frenzy. Over time, wolfsbane became shorthand for any substance that could tame beasts or unleash them. Even its scientific name, aconitum, nods to mythology derived from the Greek word for dart, referencing Hercules' use of its poison to slay the Hydra. Then there's belladonna, the beautiful lady of the poison garden. Renaissance women allegedly dripped its juice into their eyes to dilate pupils, a sign of attraction. But folklore twisted this cosmetic trick into something darker. Whispers that witches brewed it into flying ointments to commune with demons, the reality. The plant's tropane alkaloids do cause vivid hallucinations, making flight a likely description of the tripping user's experience. Churches condemned these practices, but the stories persisted, turning a practical herb into a symbol of forbidden knowledge. Superstitions also served as early warning systems. fairy rings of mushrooms weren't just enchanted dance floors in tales, they marked patches of toxic fungi. Parents told children that eating these would trap them in the underworld, a colorful deterrent against poisoning. Similarly, yew trees shading churchyards were both revered and feared. Their red berries symbolized Christ's blood, but their seeds contained toxin, a heart-stopping alkaloid. The message was clear: divinity and danger grew side by side. These myths weren't just fanciful lies, they encoded real risks in memorable ways, ensuring generations treated toxic plants with respect. When a medieval peasant crossed themselves at the sight of wolfsbane, they weren't just fearing werewolves, they were acknowledging nature's power to blur the line between remedy and ruin. The stories may have faded, but their legacy lingers every time we call something deadly nightshade instead of its proper name. Some truths, it seems, are best delivered in disguise. A single sprig of monkshood could fetch a price higher than a peasant's monthly wages. Such was the grim economy of medieval poison plants. Behind the castle walls and monastery gardens where these deadly species flourished, a thriving trade network operated in whispers and coded ledgers. Apothecaries listed toxins under genteel euphemisms like dragon's wart for arsenic or widow's comfort for belladonna, while merchants transported them in wax-sealed jars labeled as perfumes or sacramental oils. The demand was insatiable. Physicians needed precise doses for remedies, nobles sought untraceable solutions for political problems, and assassins required reliable tools of their trade. What began as botanical curiosity had blossomed into a shadow market where life and death balanced on the scales of profit. The apothecary's shop was the beating heart of this trade. These early pharmacists didn't just sell hemlock and wolfsbane, they perfected the art of plausible deniability. A customer asking for nightshade tonic might receive a mild sedative or a lethal concentration, depending on the apothecary's discretion and the thickness of the patron's purse. Records from Venice's guild archives reveal how they navigated legal grey areas. One ledger from 1423 lists a sale of Saint Hildegard's elixir to a bishop, its ingredients suspiciously matching the symptoms of a rival cleric's sudden decline. The real profit came from customization. Wealthy clients paid premium prices for poisons tailored to mimic specific illnesses. A slow-acting arsenic compound to simulate wasting sickness, or a carefully calibrated dose of digitalis to induce natural heart failure. Merchants transformed this deadly inventory into a global enterprise. Caravans carried Persian nux vomica seeds to European courts, while Venetian galleys imported Egyptian henbane under barrels of innocuous spices. The risks were astronomical. Getting caught with toxic cargo could mean execution, but so were the rewards. A single shipment of aconite roots from the Alps could buy a merchant a country estate, provided they survived the journey. Some traders employed ingenious smuggling tactics, hollowing out religious statues to conceal vials of cantarella or stitching powdered hemlock into the linings of sacred texts. The church unwittingly aided the trade by declaring certain toxins necessary for spiritual purification, granting them protected status alongside communion wine and incense. Criminals organized the trade's underbelly with chilling efficiency. In the back alleys of London and Paris, underground poison guilds operated with coded handshakes and dead drop locations. A 15th-century trial in Florence exposed a ring that trained women to administer toxins, using their status as servants or midwives to bypass suspicion. Their price lists survive in court records, revealing grim bargains: 10 silver coins for a quick parting, 20 for a death resembling plague, and 50 for framing another as the culprit. The most successful operatives were often herbwives, women who foraged legally for medicinal plants while secretly supplying assassins. When authorities raided one such woman's cottage in Burgundy, they found ledgers implicating half the local nobility in her clientele. What fueled this economy wasn't just malice but necessity. In a world without reliable banks or contracts, poison functioned as morbid insurance. A merchant might carry you extract not to murder, but to threaten a debtor into repayment. Noble families stockpiled arsenic as leverage in marriage negotiations, while bankers kept vials of water hemlock to discourage embezzlement. The threat often outweighed the act. Knowing your rival had access to untraceable toxins was sometimes enough to ensure good behavior. This created a perverse stability where the fear of poison became its own form of currency, traded as calculatedly as gold or grain. The trade's legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern pharmaceutical companies trace their origins to these medieval apothecaries, and the same profit motives persist, only now the deadly alkaloids are packaged as life-saving drugs. The next time you see a beautifully illustrated herbal manuscript, remember, those delicate paintings of foxglove and monkshood weren't just scientific records. They were price lists for the darkest commodities of their age, where a single mislabeled jar could turn medicine into murder. The same poison gardens that reshaped medieval politics left scars on the landscape itself, scars still visible today. When monks transplanted wolfsbane from alpine slopes to monastery herb beds, or nobles imported water hemlock to stock their private arsenals, they weren't just moving plants, they were unleashing ecological time bombs. These toxic immigrants often outcompeted native species, their lethal defenses making them invincible against local herbivores. Stands of deadly nightshade, originally cultivated behind castle walls, now choke riverbanks across Europe, their black berries spread by birds who evolved immunity to their poison. The very traits that made these plants useful for assassination, rapid growth, resistance to pests, turned them into botanical bullies, crowding out gentler flora that couldn't fight back. The ripple effects were profound. In England, medieval records note the disappearance of certain medicinal herbs from forests near noble estates, their habitats overrun by invasive monkshood. Peasants complained of livestock dying after grazing near abandoned poison gardens, where generations of toxic plants had leached into the soil. Even waterways weren't spared. Arsenic-laced runoff from Parisian apothecary gardens still contaminates the Seine's sediment layers, detectable 7 centuries later. What began as a human drama of power and intrigue became an environmental legacy, written in poisoned pollen grains preserved in peat bogs. Some species formed deadly alliances with their new environments. Foxglove, originally cultivated for its heart-stopping digitalis, found perfect growing conditions in the acidic soils of deforested land. Its proliferation created digitalis deserts, meadows so dense with the plant that bees visiting its bell-shaped flowers would perish, collapsing local pollination networks. Similarly, stands of hemlock along medieval trade routes likely spread via cartwheels and horse dung, their seeds hitching rides to new territories where no natural predators kept them in check. The irony is bitter. Plants used to control human populations ultimately controlled ecosystems instead. Yet nature occasionally fought back. In the Loire Valley, certain native fungi evolved to break down aconitine from invasive monkshood, gradually reclaiming poisoned patches of soil. Some birds learned to line their nests with wolfsbane leaves, exploiting their insect-repelling properties, a rare case of wildlife turning human weaponry to their advantage. These adaptations hint at a deeper truth. Medieval poison gardens didn't just alter ecosystems, they became laboratories for accelerated evolution, testing which species could endure humanity's chemical experiments. The most haunting evidence lies in place names still used today. Hemlock Hill outside Vienna, Baneberry Marsh in Norfolk, these are more than folk memories. Soil analyzers confirm elevated toxin levels matching medieval cultivation patterns, proving how deeply these plants etched themselves into the land. Walking through these landscapes now, it's hard not to wonder, when the wind rustles through a patch of belladonna, are we hearing the ghostly echo of a duke's whispered plot, or nature's long sigh at human folly? Either way, the medieval poison garden's true legacy wasn't just in the lives it ended, but in the world it permanently transformed. The poison gardens of the Middle Ages might seem like relics of a brutal past, but their legacy pulses through modern science in ways that would astonish their creators. Take chemotherapy, a treatment that harnesses the very toxins medieval herbalists feared. The yew tree, once planted in castle courtyards for its deadly taxine-laced needles, now gives us paclitaxel, a compound that fights breast and ovarian cancers. Those monks who cautiously distilled foxglove for heart ailments would marvel to see their witches' gloves refined into digitalis, regulating cardiac rhythms in hospitals worldwide. This isn't just progress, it's poetic justice, turning instruments of death into lifelines. Forensic science owes an even darker debt to these gardens. Modern toxicologists still consult medieval herbals when identifying plant-based poisons in unexplained deaths. The vivid descriptions of wolfsbane's effects, tingling lips, creeping paralysis, mirror contemporary clinical reports of aconitine poisoning. Even the Borgia's infamous cantarella finds its parallel in today's ricin investigations, proving that while toxins evolve, their detection relies on centuries of accumulated wisdom. Crime labs now train with historical cases, recognizing that the untraceable murders of the past hold lessons for solving present-day crimes. Ethically, these gardens force us to confront uncomfortable questions about knowledge and power. Medieval monasteries hoarded botanical secrets like gold, and modern pharmaceutical companies patent life-saving drugs derived from traditional remedies. When a single gram of synthetic aconitine costs more than medieval peasants earned in a lifetime, have we really moved beyond the poison garden's exclusivity? Initiatives like the open-source pharma movement challenge this, advocating for shared medical knowledge, a digital twist on the monastic herbalists who once traded recipes across continents. The environmental impact of these gardens also speaks to current crises. Invasive species like water hemlock, spread by medieval trade, now cost billions annually to control. Yet their resilience offers clues for restoring damaged ecosystems. Scientists study how certain plants thrived in toxic soils, applying those lessons to clean up industrial waste sites. The same adaptability that made monkshood a killer makes its descendants potential saviors of polluted land. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in duality. Medieval minds saw no contradiction in a garden that both healed and harmed, and modern medicine wrestles with the same paradox. Radiation treats cancer even as it causes it. Opioids relieve agony while fueling epidemics. The poison garden teaches us that nothing in nature is purely good or evil, only our choices determine which face it shows. Walking through a modern botanical garden today, past neatly labeled beds of medicinal plants, it's easy to forget their lethal potential. But the echoes are there, in the gloves worn by handlers pruning oleander, the warning signs near castor bean plants. These precautions are our inheritance from an age when people understood plants as both allies and assassins. The next time you pop an aspirin, remember, its ancestor, willow bark, was once brewed into teas that could soothe fevers or stop a heart, depending on the hand that measured the dose. Some knowledge, it seems, is perennial. The poisoned orchard teaches us that history, like nature, thrives in contradictions where splendor and danger share the same soil. Those medieval gardens weren't merely backdrops for romance or piety. They were stages where power played out in petals and poison. Think of a lord walking guests past blooming foxglove, their bell-shaped flowers nodding innocently in the breeze. To the uninitiated, it was a display of wealth. To those who understood the subtext, it was a silent threat: cross me, and these very blooms could still your heart. This duality captivates us because it mirrors human nature itself, our capacity to create and destroy, often with the same hands. What makes these gardens so haunting isn't just their lethality, but their intimacy. Poison wasn't wielded from a distance like a sword or arrow. It was served in shared meals, slipped into farewell kisses, or hidden in the bouquet placed at a rival's bedside. Personal touch made it terrifying. A noblewoman might spend years tending her roses, only to pluck one thorny stem to coat its tip in wolfsbane. The same care that nurtured beauty could weaponize it. This blurring of roles, gardener and assassin, healer and executioner, forces us to question how easily boundaries collapse when survival is at stake. Yet there's an unexpected lesson here about resilience. Just as those plants adapted to thrive in hostile environments, so did the people who wielded them. Women barred from politics used herbology to tip the scales. Monks cloistered in piety mastered toxins to protect their orders. Even peasants with no access to swords could harvest ditch-grown hemlock to settle scores. The poison garden, in all its grim ingenuity, reveals how marginalized voices found ways to speak, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in lethal doses. Today, we've traded hemlock for herbicides and arsenic for antibiotics, but the core tension remains. Walk through any modern pharmacy and you'll see the ghost of those medieval gardens, drugs derived from deadly plants, their dosages measured to heal instead of harm. The difference: our poisons now come with warning labels and childproof caps, yet the allure of the forbidden lingers. Tourists flock to places like Alnwick's poison garden, pressing against iron gates to glimpse belladonna's glossy berries, as if proximity to danger still thrills us centuries later. So the next time you admire a flower's delicate petals or inhale the scent of fresh herbs, pause. Remember that beauty has always been a currency, one that buys admiration, yes, but also obedience, fear, even silence. History's darkest lessons often grow in sunlight, camouflaged among the roses. And if this glimpse into the shadowed corners of the past has left you hungry for more hidden stories, let us know what mysteries we should unearth next. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the conversation below. After all, knowledge, like a well-tended garden, thrives